So, as you probably know, Richard Dawkins is probably the most famous atheist in the world right now. And I came across this very interesting short video by him on 5 reasons why there is no God. So let's take a look at it and see what he has to say.
What are the 5 best reasons why there is no God? What are the 5 reasons why there are no fairies? The onus is not...
Okay, well, let's just stop right there. There is not actually, fairies and God are not actually in the same category when we're talking about reasons to believe that God exists or that fairies exist. For example, if you go to most first-year philosophy courses on probably most of the universities in the Western world, you will see that a portion of the course actually deals with various arguments for the existence of God. And an argument is actually a reason to believe that God exists. Now, whether those arguments are compelling, that's a different question. But there are reasons on the table as to why we believe in God, but you'll find very little time spent in philosophy dealing with arguments for the existence of fairies. That the two are really not in the same category.
Upon an atheist to say why there is not something. The onus is on a theist to say why there is. Having said that,
well, he would be right if in fact there were no reasons whatsoever to believe that God exists. But as I already mentioned, that's not the case. In philosophy, if he checked out a first-year philosophy course on his university, there are reasons there. And once there are reasons on the table, then the onus is actually on the atheist to respond to those reasons, to say why, despite the arguments and despite whatever evidence might be put forward, he will still deny the existence of God. So the onus is on him once you have reasons.
It is a very interesting question, because a universe with a God would be a very different kind of universe than one without. So the most important reason is there simply are no reasons for the existence of a God. So,
Okay, well, as I mentioned before, it would have been helpful if he'd have checked out the first-year philosophy course on his very university to acquaint himself with some of the reasons or arguments being put forward. But perhaps he actually is cognizant of some of these arguments. We'll see what he has to say.
So the reasons against then would have to be you tick off on your fingers one by one the alleged reasons why there should be a God, such as the argument from design. Things look so beautifully designed, bananas and apples and things like that, and humans and kangaroos and so on. And they look as though they've been designed because that's what Darwinian natural selection does. It makes them look as though they're designed. It produces a very good simulacrum of design. I think that's the most important reason against, that Darwin has exploded once and for all the argument from design.
Well, I think that's a bit of a misconception there. What Darwin did was provide us with a number of creative possibilities to explain how all of life as we see it today has arisen from maybe a single common ancestor. And he also put forward various interesting ideas on natural selection, for example. When we actually test these out in real life, we find that Darwinian theory is beautifully tested and reproduced when it comes to variation within existing life forms. But an explanation is not a scientific explanation until we can test and reproduce it. If we cannot reproduce it, then it fails as a scientific explanation. So it works very well for horizontal variation within existing life forms through natural selection, as he mentioned. But all of our attempts to reproduce this, as far as vertical evolution goes, as far as the evolving of new life forms and get anywhere, has completely failed. It has been falsified. Basically what I mean here is that a creative story is all we're left with when it comes to producing increasing complex life forms. And an example would be the long-term evolutionary experiment by Lenski, where we've evolved bacteria for over 60,000 generations, and we didn't get anywhere as far as generating a novel gene or so forth. We could perhaps say, well, what if it takes millions and millions of years to do this? We won't expect to see it in just 60,000 generations. But the thing about science is that you can actually radically speed up a process once you remove the luck from it. And the reason it takes millions and millions of years, according to the creative story that Darwin left us, is because there's so much chance involved. But in a lab, we can remove that chance and we can direct that evolution and see where it goes. And thus far, it has, we failed to reproduce. This is the most famous theory in the history of science that we've utterly failed to reproduce thus far when it comes to vertical evolution. Works very well for horizontal variation.
Other reasons that have been offered, for example, people claim to have a subjective experience, a personal experience of God. Well, we all know how easily people are fooled. We all know how easily people hallucinate, how easily they imagine, how easily they dream. So that's an extremely poor argument in favor of the existence of a God. What other arguments are there?
He's got an interesting point there, but I think he fails to distinguish between phenomena that are experienced by a very small minority or percentage of the population versus something that the majority of the population claims to sense or have some intuitive perception of. And that's where there's a massive difference between the majority of the population who believes that there is something out there that has created nature and so forth versus people who are having hallucinations or believe they've been abducted by UFOs or whatever. That's an extremely small percentage of the population. So when you find yourself confronting a phenomenon that the majority of the population seems to be experiencing or at least has some sort of intuitive perception of, then you do need to take that seriously. You need to ask the question, what is the cause of this? We can explain hallucinations and so forth, but this is on a totally different level. When the majority of the population throughout history seems to intuitively perceive that there's a creator behind nature.
The argument from first cause, well, that shoots itself in the foot, because if you're going to postulate a God as a first cause, you've then got a really big problem explaining where the God came from.
Okay, he likes to say this a lot. You know, if God's going to create the universe, then where did God come from? But the argument, that doesn't mean anything. It doesn't do anything. For example, I might hold up my coffee cup here and I'll say, oh, look, there's a date on the bottom, therefore this must have a beginning. Well, what caused that? And somebody might say, well, I think there was a factory that built this. Oh, well, then you've got a really big problem, because what caused the factory? Well, okay, then we'll deal with what caused the factory, but it in no way diminishes the need for believing that there's a factory behind this cup any more than believing that there's a God behind a creator, some sort of a creator behind the origin of nature itself.
The whole point of the Darwinian enterprise is that it explains how you can get complexity and the illusion of design from primordial simplicity. So the argument from first cause shoots itself in the foot.
Well, actually, he's quite wrong on this. That's my area of specialty. I did my PhD in bioinformatics, specializing in the information coded in DNA, RNA, and proteins, and specifically looking at the role of functional information, the genetic information carried there. We have utterly failed to come up with any kind of testable, reproducible, natural way of producing this kind of information. And there's very good reasons for that, which we'll get into now. So no, Darwin had a story of how it might happen, but he knew nothing of genetics and genetic information back in the day. All we can do today is mostly wreck the information in DNA. Mutations, by and large, will have a greater probability of degenerating the information rather than improving the information. And as far as creating completely novel protein coding functional genes, I'm afraid that we're in trouble there.
Pascal's wager, you're better off betting that there is a God, because if you lose the bet, then you go to hell. That's a silly argument, because it depends on, it assumes that you know which God it is for a start. If you bet on Yahweh and it turns out to be Baal or Thor, then you're in trouble.
Well, okay. Not all gods are created equal, let's put it this way. If you have a buffet and all the gods are spread out, you'll find that most of them, or a lot of them, just really don't have achieved a prominent status in historical humanity. Whereas if you look at, for example, the Judeo-Christian God, you'll find that roughly 1 billion people right now think there is such a God. So that doesn't prove that God exists. It doesn't even prove that Thor isn't the real one. But what it does do is give us maybe some way of eliminating some of the candidates so that we can reduce it down to a short list.
What else? In any case, even if it was Yahweh, you might well say that Yahweh would rather have somebody honest who thinks for himself rather than somebody who slavishly pretends to believe something.
Well, I would totally agree with him on this last point. I have nothing to say about that other than to say I totally agree.
So there are no good arguments in favor of a God, and that's all one needs to say.
Well, as I hoped I was able to point out, I think he still has quite a bit of work to do. But in fairness, this video was only 2.5 minutes long, and to deal with the kind of arguments that first-year philosophy and even graduate school philosophy deals with, you're going to need a lot more than just 2.5 minutes.